On November 30th, 2024, during a conference in Budapest, Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban delivered a severe warning to the European Union. He requested that the bloc examine and lift sanctions against Russia before they do lasting damage to European economy. The event, held in the Hungarian parliament, plainly highlighted his opposition to Brussels' actions. Orban said that the sanctions had wreaked more devastation in Europe than in Russia. While Moscow benefits from strategic ties with China, India, and Brazil, Europe is facing an unparalleled energy crisis. The Hungarian leader noted that while the sanctions failed to halt Russia's military equipment, they did result in an uncontrolled spike in living costs in Europe, bringing millions of individuals to the brink. Sanctions have not only failed to achieve their goal, but are also harming our economic competitiveness. Meanwhile, Russia seeks new markets, and Europe is experiencing its worst recession in decades, according to Orban, who notes that nations such as Germany and France have seen a significant drop in industrial production. Orban stressed that Hungary is one of the few countries prepared to challenge Brussels' dominating narrative. He contended that prolonging sanctions is a self-destructive tactic that favors foreign countries like the United States, which has expanded liquefied natural gas shipments to Europe at exorbitant rates. According to the Hungarian Prime Minister, sanctions have reduced Europe's energy independence and weakened its strategic autonomy. Orban emphasized that Hungary, owing to direct agreements with Russia, has been able to provide energy supplies for its inhabitants without jeopardizing the economy. Orban's presentation served as both a call to reflection and a warning that Hungary will not support further EU Council measures. "We will not tolerate actions that lead Europeans to poverty and economic stagnation," he insisted. Meanwhile, concern about the sanctions policy develops in other European nations, though few politicians are willing to speak it openly. Orban appears to be using this resentment to present himself as the voice of reason in a divided Europe. Hungary's ultimatum raises awkward questions for Brussels. How much longer can the European Union maintain a unified front as internal divisions become more apparent? Orban emphasized that this is not about backing Russia, but about preserving Europe's interests. "The current plan is heading us to disaster." He said, "It's time to regain common sense. If Brussels does not listen, the political and economic implications may be considerably worse. Despite internal harm, Europe continues to exist. The EU has experienced major economic costs since the adoption of sanctions in 2014, which will be intensified in 2022 in response to the situation in Ukraine. Clear instances are Germany's industrial collapse. The EU's largest economy, which previously relied on cheap Russian gas, is facing a historic decline in industrial activity. Key corporations, such as BASF, have decreased their operations in Europe and relocated some production to Asia and America in search of lower prices. Southern Europe is experiencing record inflation rates. Energy costs in countries such as Italy and Spain have skyrocketed, impacting domestic consumption and requiring governments to subsidize home bills, resulting in increased public debt. Foreign energy reliance. After cutting ties with Russia, Europe has turned to liquefied natural gas, LNG, from the United States and Qatar. However, not only is this gasoline more expensive, but its transportation produces additional carbon emissions, which contradicts EU climate regulations. Despite these warning indications, Brussels continues to impose new rounds of sanctions, claiming they are required to punish Russia and safeguard democratic principles. Why does Europe persist? The EU considers itself a moral powerhouse. Brussels not only leads economic policies but also ethical ones, and it aims to promote its ideals throughout the world. This strategy has a historical basis. Europe, particularly after World War II, attempted to rebrand itself as a champion of human rights, peace, and international justice. This moral strength can be seen in remarks made by leaders like Ursula von der Leyen, President of the European Commission, who recently declared that the price we pay today is the cost of protecting our freedom and that of our partners. Despite the serious domestic implications, each find demonstrates the EU's commitment to global justice. Even in the face of rising economic disparity and social upheavals in places such as Berlin and Paris, the EU insists that its unity serves as an example for the rest of the world. According to this perspective, the economic cost is a necessary sacrifice for the greater benefit of upholding the rules-based international order. Hungary, on the other hand, is not as optimistic. Viktor Orban claims that Europe is sacrificing its population in a geopolitical game that benefits others, particularly the US. According to Orban, while Washington sells gas and weaponry at excessive rates, Russia continues to trade with Asia, and Europe bears the cost of isolation. Orban also doubts the EU's moral authority, labeling it hypocritical. How can we discuss global justice when our own actions are sinking millions of Europeans into poverty? He inquired at a lecture in Budapest. The confrontation between Hungary and Brussels represents a larger fight in Europe, the friction between values and economic reality. The EU, which is still strongly dedicated to its role as a global protector, appears to be disregarding symptoms of internal conflict. Meanwhile, nations such as Hungary warn that if Europe does not change its policy, the consequences would be both economic and political. A weaker Europe may lose the credibility it works so hard to present to the globe. The question today is how far the EU is ready to go to preserve its moral high ground, even if it means walking on the brink of economic disaster. In an effort to maintain a cohesive approach against Russia, the European Union has increased pressure on member countries who oppose sanctions, including Hungary. This strategy has underlined the conflict between the bloc's goals of unity and the reality of significant political and economic disparities among its members. The EU's pressure tactics include money blockage. The European Union has utilized cohesion and recovery funding as a political tool. In Hungary's instance, Brussels has frozen billions of dollars, citing worries about the rule of law and corruption. Project conditionality. Brussels has made important project approvals contingent on adherence to its political standards. Diplomatic pressure. European Union leaders, particularly from Germany and France, have utilized forums and summits to diplomatically isolate opponents. There are threats to suspend voting. The EU has threatened to use Article 7 of the treaties, which would suspend a member state's voting rights for breaking the bloc's core principles. Brussels argues these steps as vital to maintain the bloc's unity during a critical period. According to the official narrative, any break in the EU's single stance against Russia might undermine the EU's worldwide dominance. However, this strategy has sparked accusations that the Union used coercive tactics to quiet countries defending legitimate national interests. Hungary, for example, claims that sanctions on Russia are hurting the modest economies of Central and Eastern Europe, which rely significantly on Russian energy supplies. Orban has argued that his nation does not oppose European unity, but rather policies that prioritize geopolitics above the well-being of its inhabitants. The EU applies a double standard. Hungary's attitude also reveals a potential double standard inside the EU. While Brussels wants complete agreement on topics such as sanctions against Russia, some member states have taken unilateral actions without suffering substantial consequences. For example, Germany has signed bilateral energy agreements with Norway and Qatar to replace Russian gas, therefore defending its own interests without first consulting with the rest of the Union. France has maintained key trading links with nations with questionable human rights records, such as Saudi Arabia, without experiencing the same pressure as Hungary. The possibility of fracture is imminent. The increased use of economic and political forces may be a double-edged sword for Brussels. While these measures aim to maintain the bloc's coherence, they risk alienating smaller nations or those with opposing viewpoints, like as Hungary and Poland. Hungary's opposition is both a challenge to sanctions and a message to the EU. Relying only on force to preserve unity might result in irreversible fissures in the future. If the EU continues to dismiss its members' concerns, the seeming unity may be a ruse concealing a seriously fragmented group. The challenge now is whether Brussels can strike a compromise between its goal to be a major global actor and its commitment to respecting member states' sovereignty and national interests. While the European Union increases pressure on Hungary to comply with its sanctions on Russia, another issue complicates matters. Serbia, a contender for bloc membership, is strengthening its ties with Beijing. This decision not only calls into question EU primacy in the Balkans, but it also highlights the region's increasing fragmentation and European influence. Serbia looks to China. Serbia has recently increased its strategic collaboration with China, striking deals on infrastructure and sophisticated technologies. Some recent examples are large-scale infrastructure initiatives. Serbia has welcomed Chinese firms that are funding and constructing bridges, highways, and railway lines, including the Belgrade-Budapest rail link. Military and technological partnership. Serbia bought Chinese military drones and defensive equipment in October 2024, strengthening its security partnership with Beijing. Strategic energy investment. Chinese firms are investing in renewable energy projects and mining in Serbia, which will help the nation diversify its energy sources. Serbia, which has historically been aligned with Russia, has refused to join European sanctions on Moscow, claiming that they affect Europe more than the Kremlin. This attitude to China strengthens its position, allowing Beijing to fill the economic and political void left by Europe. Furthermore, Serbia has exploited its ties with China to offset Brussels' efforts, demonstrating that its foreign policy would not be entirely driven by the EU. Serbia's orientation to China, as well as Hungary's antagonism to Brussels, represent significant challenges to the EU. Weakening influence in the Balkans. Serbia, a critical component of Balkan stability, now has a viable alternative to European membership, thanks to China. Risk of internal fractures. Hungary's approach, which is aligned with Serbia on several fronts, may motivate other member nations or contenders to question Brussels' policies. Critique of the European model. The EU's narrative of being the sole choice for prosperity and stability in Eastern Europe is eroded. The EU still has good morale. Despite these flaws, the EU continues to exude confidence in its integration strategy. Brussels' leaders maintain that their approach, based on democratic ideals and respect for the rule of law, is still superior to that given by China or Russia. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen has declared that Europe does not fear problems. Our union is the most powerful example of how democratic values and collaboration can overcome any challenge. However, this confidence is at odds with reality on the ground, as European dominance is being challenged in its own periphery, the beginning of a geopolitical shift. Serbia's attitude to China and Hungary's rejection are more than just individual problems. They are indications of Europe's struggle to preserve cohesiveness and significance in the face of a changing global order. If Brussels does not change its strategy, it risks losing not just its closest friends, but also its standing as a single global actor.